Congressman, thank you very much for your time and being with us today. What was your first impression and reaction getting the news about the destruction of the Armenian church in Syria by ISIS?
I mean, I was horrified because, you know, I always worry that the Armenian genocide repeats itself. And, you know, we've seen ever since the genocide in 1915, we've seen on numerous occasions where there have been efforts to eradicate, kill Armenians because of their nationality. You know, to see this done at a site in the desert where so many Armenians were killed in the aftermath of 1915 was horrific, because it shows that the hatred or the potential for genocide continues.
What can be done more to stop this aggression from Islamic State? Do you think the airstrikes are enough, or ground troops?
Well, I mean, obviously the United States and the allies within the Arab world and others that they hope to get are involved in a war or campaign against ISIL. You know, hopefully that succeeds. But, you know, other than that, I think in a longer term, or maybe in a, you know, more macro sense, I just think it's necessary to be an advocate, if you will, and to spread the word that, you know, ideologies that countenance genocide should not be allowed to exist. And you know, this is the problem, is that so often now we see ideology, or religious ideology, creating hatred. And so I think we have to continue to speak out against that in the way that we speak out against genocide, wherever it occurs.
So in this regard, what can be done more to stop this misrepresenting Islam to fuel genocide in the Middle East?
I mean, I think that's the problem. I mean, it's not just Islam. We see in many cases around the world where countries are Buddhist, or countries are Hindu, or countries are Christian, you know, there are elements, extreme elements, that would advocate, you know, extermination, if you will, of people who are not of the same religion, or even the same brand of the religion. And so that's why I say that it's very important to continue to advocate, whether it's through the UN or international organizations, that there be tolerance of other religions or other brands of religions, and that, you know, even though you don't agree or want to practice the other religion, that you don't seek to kill the people because they do. But unfortunately, we're seeing this in so many places. I mean, ISIL is probably the most extreme example, but there are others.
How do you assess the U.S.-Armenia relationship as friendly countries, and what can be done more to strengthen this relationship further?
Well, I think, as you know, we have the Armenia Caucus, which I continue to be the Democratic chair. And, you know, it's the kinds of things we do in the caucus, which is, you know, trying to provide assistance to Armenia, you know, trying to increase trade with Armenia, as much as possible, have exchanges with members of parliament, you know, visits by Armenian leaders and politicians to the United States, any events of a cultural nature that have people learn more about Armenian culture, or certainly about the Armenian genocide. I mean, all those things.
If Armenia eventually joins customs union, do you think it will suffer politically and economically? And if yes, what can America do, US do, for helping or assisting Armenia in this regard? Let's remember that Russia is already suffering international sanctions.
Right. Well, I think that the concern I have about the Russians' customs union is that it appears to be forced. In other words, you know, unlike the European Union, where countries are voluntarily joining it because they think they benefit from it, you get the impression that the Russian government and Putin are basically saying, look, we, you know, join the customs union or else. I don't know the details about, you know, whether or not Armenia's economy will, benefit or suffer from the Russians' customs union. I just worry about whether it's actually being organized by Russia for good purposes, as opposed to just an extension of its effort to, have more countries under its orbit, particularly those who were former Soviet republics. But I think that, it's one important thing for the United States to do is to continue to promote trade and economic development in Armenia, and so that Armenia doesn't just become dependent on Russia, for more and more of its economy and for more and more of its jobs and its energy and other resources.
Do you think it will be possible?
I think so. Look, we still have trade. Of course, the sanctions now are going to make it, less and less trade with Russia, but that doesn't apply to Armenia. As far as I know, none of the sanctions apply to other countries and wouldn't apply just because Armenia or some other country joined the Russian customs union. I guess you could say there's an indirect impact if Armenia is part of this customs union because there's going to be less and less trade with Russia.
Right.
But I think that you try to counteract that by increasing U.S. trade with Armenia.
What's your approach about the recent declaration from Armenia that they want to recall the Turkish-Armenia protocols?
To me, I think that makes perfect sense. I have to be honest with you. The protocols are dead. Armenia tried from the beginning, to push the protocols, and Turkey has been totally intransigent. So, in my opinion, they're totally justified in withdrawing the protocols because they're meaningless.
In Armenia, people are very interested in the results and on the fact of referendums in different countries, particularly in Scotland. What would U.S. reaction be, or would United States of America recognize the independence of Scotland if it voted yes?
Look, I have to separate my view from maybe what the State Department view. I don't really know what the State Department view is. I think that the principle that countries have a right to determine their own fate and that nations have a right of self-determination is ingrained in international law and in the UN Charter. And so any people that feel that they would like to have a referendum and become independent, have the right to have the referendum. Even if a referendum is held, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to move ahead with independence. But I personally feel that that's an inherent right under international law for any people, and I have often said that when it comes to Nagorno-Karabakh, not only did they have that right under international law, but they also had that right under the Soviet Constitution because they were, I know there's different categories. I guess they were an oblast, is that what it was called under Soviet law? It was essentially,
oblast?
Oblast, which is essentially, which is a little different from a autonomous region. But under the Soviet Constitution, an oblast had the right to separate, not only from the Republic of Azerbaijan, but the republics had the right to secede from the Soviet Union. So they exercised that right both under Soviet law as well as under international law, and decided to set up their own state, which they're perfectly entitled to. But I think what you're seeing now is as the world, I guess the best way to describe this is as different regions of the world become more peaceful and there's less possibility of war, and that comes, of course, in Europe, from the European Union, that I think a lot of these peoples who historically were not allowed to have their own independence are going to seek it. So I think it's likely in the next generation or so that we are going to see an effort for, a lot, whether it's Catalonia or it's the Basques or it's Scotland, either to have independence or to certainly have more autonomy within the countries that they've historically been part of.
Congressman, one more question about Armenia Azerbaijan relations and these recent clashes. What do you think? What will be done? What is needed to be done to stop all these clashes on the borders and
well, I mean, I
capturing
think a lot of
people.
it, look, there's a lot of saber rattling, as you know, in Azerbaijan by the president and different Azerbaijan leaders. And I think the only way that you're going to counteract that and prevent it from becoming a potential conflict again is by having, what do we call them? I forget there's an official term, but I think, more cooperative measures. In other words, if you can get Azerbaijan and Armenia to cooperate together on water rights or on agriculture or other items where you would lessen tensions, that's the only way to counteract that, I think. And unfortunately, there isn't much going on in that respect. There was a time in Congress when we actually had a proposal that would provide significant funding to any of the Caucasus nations who cooperated on a whole series of activities, like the railroad or water projects, for example. But there's been less and less of that. But I think the U.S. Congress would be very supportive of any kind of cooperative efforts in any sector, and would probably be willing to provide funding for it if that occurred. And that could be between Azerbaijan and Armenia, between Georgia and Armenia, or all three.
Mr. Pallone, would you like to add anything?
No, I mean, the hard part for Armenia is, and it's such a dangerous part of the world, and so I think that we in Congress, and particularly those in the Armenian caucus, understand the difficulties that Armenia faces because all this conflict swirls around them, not only over themselves and Nagorno-Karabakh, but everything. So it's just, it's a tough place, and as Americans, we have to continue to be supportive of Armenia, knowing full well that they can't always do what we think is in America's interest. But you have to understand that it's a tough world that they live in, and it's not just a recent phenomena. It's a phenomena that goes back thousands of years. Whether you were in the Roman Empire competing with the Persian Empire, or it's just the way it is, unfortunately.
Congressman, thank you very much.
All right.
For this interview. Thanks a lot.